Well, good morning, and it's wonderful to be here. I think most of you probably realized yesterday we had a little bit of an announcement buying the deepwater assets of Freeport-McMoRan for $2 billion. I'm sure there may be a question or two in the room about that. Yeah, I think our industry is back. I think there are evidences that there's life in our industry again, although I will say the last 2 years has really been very difficult. Most of us have gone through lots of painful things, including workforce reductions in capital budgets. But as it is the case in our industry, when you've been around it long enough, you know we go through these swings as part of what we do. Now, surviving in a world where you have to do certain things that you didn't think about, I always like to refer back to something I thought about as a child when I watched college football on Saturdays to sort of lever off Mr. Manning last evening. And I recall Frank Broyles always telling Keith Jackson, "You can't coach speed, Keith." And those of you that remember those comments, as I thought about them as I got older, well, really what that translated into me is you really have to hire smart people, and smart people, you can't make them smarter. You can't hire somebody that's and make them smart. They're smart to begin with. If they really want to work hard, you can improve that a little bit. But being able to find those people that fit the culture of your organization, that do the things you want, that you believe are the things that will cause you to be successful, are very important. Earlier this year, I was at a Wells Fargo conference where they were asking me at that time, pardon me, to talk about where I thought oil and gas prices would go over the next couple of years and what it was going to mean for our industry. And I think I was probably in the camp and had been since January of the year before for almost 18 months that we were in a bear market for oil. Oil is not likely to recover. If you think back, there was a very prolific view that we would be a V-shaped recovery, not a U-shaped recovery. We saw a lot of generalist investors to get into our industry as investors, and they thought that would be a very quick recovery. And I think many of us that have been around for a long time felt like this had a lot of what we saw in the mid-'80s, for hopefully not as long, but still some of the elements of what we saw in the 86 to 91 period. But I will say in June, I made the comment, and I still believe it, that we're more likely than not to have a $60 oil price as an average price for 2017. I think recovery's coming. I could walk you through some of the supply and demand fundamentals associated with that, but largely in this country, we've gone from 9.6 million barrels a day of production, and I think we'll probably bottom out at around 8. The market is generally 1.5 million barrels today oversupplied with crude. I think the hope and expectation that OPEC will enter into a freeze is probably in the hearts and minds of people that like to go to Disneyland and think about things that are sort of comical. We'll see a freeze when every OPEC nation is at the maximum capacity to produce. Then they'll freeze. Before then, they have no economic incentive to freeze because some of their market shares can get picked up by somebody else. So where's the supply contraction going to come from? Well, unfortunately, it's going to come from us. And this country is not the swing producer that the media likes to make us out to sound like. We are not. That marginal producer, that swing producer, sits in the Middle East. And I know yesterday you heard a lot from yesterday's speaker about just exactly the politics in the region, because the religion issues and the politics in that industry, in that part of the world, generate a lot of what that industry does in our business. So surviving in a period like this has been pretty impressive. You think back when oil started going down almost 2 years ago around this time, no one could have imagined that oil would go below $30 a barrel. I mean, if you exist in this room, I'll be surprised, because I don't know of anyone that ever imagined that would happen. But our industry's been very resilient, because the view is that somewhere around $75 would be that break even by which marginal costs would be overridden by marginal income. And so therefore our break even was around 75. Well, our industry has found ways to be more efficient, to take costs out of the system, and to do things quicker, better, faster, and cheaper. So today, for instance, the most prolific activity in our industry is going on in the Delaware Basin. As one company there, I can tell you our present value for an investment there with a 10% rate of return, a PV10, is less than $35 a barrel. And I couldn't imagine standing in front of you 2 years ago and saying that. Similarly, we see that happening in other areas onshore in the U.S. I think the reality is our industry is not one that gets government bailouts. It's not one that goes through and asks other people for help. If you go back since early 1970s when we had the oil embargo, our industry's had a lot of bankruptcies. We've had a lot of people go through tough times. Our industry is noted for people who go from boom to bust. And that's just sort of what happens in our industry. Consequently, when you think about kind of where we are today and you compare it to the 86 to 91 period, it doesn't feel nearly that bad. If you were around and you worked in an industry at that time, you understand it. Now, one of the things that makes us quicker, better, faster is technology. And I feel very strongly about this. Several years ago, as I was looking at our company and trying to project where we needed to be into the next decade, I realized that we were starting to embark a little bit upon the use of big data technology, but at a very small level. And that really our industry was going to have to figure out through the use of big data what we didn't know about how we could drill wells better in order to stay in the zone longer, to drill it faster, to have fewer days on location. So we started looking at this, and ultimately I concluded what I also needed was not only just a management focus on it, but I needed someone in the boardroom that actually was a good resource as well as a good check and balance for management. So I spent a better part of 18 months working with the head of my governance and risk committee, which is the committee of the board that actually considers board candidates, and distilled it down to a short list. And ultimately, just about a year ago this time, we brought someone on our board that understands that. Now, guess what? They're not 55 to 70 years old. And so you got to be prepared for getting someone from Silicon Valley or from the tech sector that understands it, that's going to probably be in their 30s. So today, I'm proud to say we have a board member that's 36 years old. His name's Dr. Sean Gorley. He has a PhD in physics from Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He's now into his third successful startup, and the first two are associated with big data. This one's more associated with artificial intelligence. And I really believe the use of big data and artificial intelligence as we think about the next decade, as we move into the 2020s, there's a lot of things that we do today that will change and make the cost of what we do a lot less, and technology is going to lead that. Now, I'm no crystal ball, and I don't predict the future, but I do think it's likely, if you go to the doctor today, if you go to a radiologist, AI is being used to read x-rays. I think it's very likely that we're going to see AI become and have the ability to read seismic. Now, a little like the machines that were developed first to play chess and now have been developed to play the Chinese game Go, which is a three-dimensional game, much more difficult rather for a machine to understand. We still today have a machine that can play Go. We will have a machine that will read our seismic in the next decade, is my prediction. It's too much opportunity. So the ability to think about how we take all the terabytes of data we have around just seismic for a moment and be able to better interpret it, to better use it, to better explore with it, to better develop with it. I think what that will do is a change agent for the things that today have been incredible in the way in which technology in the last 10 to 15 years has changed our industry. Coming back to yesterday's announcement on our part, I do think oil will come back up. I do think oil will find a new equilibrium, but it won't be 90 or 100, and it doesn't need to be. As I have said for the better part of 2 years, we are not in the revenue business. We're in the margin business. How we control that margin, how well we as companies and industry are able to make sure that we understand what our profits are at the wellhead will dictate how we deploy capital. Consequently, And it's going to be different by basin, it's going to be different by company, so this is not a hard and fast comment across every company and every play. But I really do believe $65 to $70 is the margin that we were getting at 90. If you remember a couple years ago, pardon me, at CIRA, John Watson, CEO of Chevron, made the comment that $100 is the new 20. And he was talking about service cost inflation and how they, Chevron, were believing that they were getting the margin at 100 they used to get at 20. That was a fairly dramatic comment. I think there was a lot of people went, huh? But I think John was onto something in the sense that we had had such a run-up in costs, particularly in deep water, where the deep water production solutions, the deep water development requirements, particularly as we drilled deeper, just became incredible. And then you couple that with the companies that were drilling through salt canopies and trying to image with their seismic below that salt canopy, it got even more difficult. So today, I do think between 65 and 70, depending upon the play, depending upon the company, we probably, when we get back to that, will have the same margins that we had once before. So we don't need 90 to 100 again. And I think it's the use of technology combined with being able to understand what we're doing with that technology differently is going to lead to that. And I feel so strongly about it. As I said, I put someone on our board, or our board nominated someone for our board that our board concurred on, that will give us insight as not just to how to use it, but also to think about how we use that person as a resource. Because almost all your companies, I can tell you without any hesitation, your board is a resource to management. They are not there as a rubber stamp. They're not there to be a check and balance all the time for management. They're there as a resource. And your board's got to be used by management as resources. And to have someone from the tech sector doing something in an area that's currently cutting edge is not going to be resonant in most people 55 to 70. Just not possible. Because the ideas coming out of the new PhDs with electrical engineering degrees, mechanical engineering degrees, are very difficult. As I was telling Sean, our board member, I told him, I said, your biggest challenge, his time he was 35, is your biggest challenge is you're used to being the talent. And at some point, a lot of people have been the talent. Few people learn how to manage the talent. I told him, I said, now do you think the next round of whatever you do next, the next team of PhDs you hire, you can keep up with? He goes, no, I can hardly keep up with this round of PhDs. And this is a man I'm sure has an IQ approaching 200. And even he is going to struggle with keeping up with the next generation of PhDs because he's going to have to learn how to manage the talent. That's still a struggle for all of us. And I think one of the things I'm going to close with, and we'll turn it to Q&A, is that when you have operations around the world, there are two things that are glaringly obvious to you that the world wants that the United States produces. It's our high tech and our oil and gas technology. Made in America really means something around the world when you're delivering those two products. There is not a country in the world that wants Chinese technology to develop oil and gas. There's not a country in the world that wants Russian technology to develop oil and gas. They want American technology. And it's the marriage of high tech and oil and gas technologies that we've historically used and thought about that I think will give us a competitive advantage in the next decade. And that's what keeps me kind of thinking about what we're going to do next. And with that, why don't I stop and turn it to some questions? Yeah, questions from anywhere.
Hi, Ben Williams from Devon Energy. You talked a little bit about this, but besides just focusing on reducing cost, have you seen the technology that you're talking about start to improve the top line, the production that you're getting out of a given well, you just touched on it a little bit. I wondered if maybe you could share a few things about how that's improving the production you're getting or the EUR or the MPV equation on the top side.
Yeah, I think for most of us in industry, I wouldn't say this is unique to Anadarko. I think our industry today has done a pretty good job of taking big data analytics and looking at the tens and thousands of wells that we've drilled. We've looked at the depth, we've looked at the horizontal lateral, we've looked at the number of stage of completions, and we've been able to figure out and optimize what that's going to do to produce a better and higher EUR. So there's no doubt in my mind that we've started down the path of improving EURs with technology. And I think we can get a lot better. Early on, if you've been in this industry long enough to remember, at the beginning of the shale revolution, we porpoised, meaning we went in and out of a shale probably 4 or 5 times in that initial lateral. And the reason was we didn't have geosteering technology to stay in the zone long, and we weren't drilling with seismic. So it was like driving a car at night without any headlights. And today, we actually have a much better idea how to stay in the zone. We know how far the laterals need to be and the number of completions, because I think for a long time, more was always better, longer was always better, and then we found out, well, that's not so much the case. And it's been an amazing process, but I think it's all those terabytes of data that have been able to be distilled down into something useful to allow your company, my company, everybody in our industry that has the wherewithal to use big data analytics to understand things that we would have never imagined even 5 years ago. Thanks for the question.
You mentioned the changing price, the changing break-even price for Anadarko. Because it moves, the services move with the price of oil, how are we going to keep our costs of supply low as the price goes to 60 and better the margin so we're not sitting at 100, equivalent to 20?
Well, that will be a bit of a conundrum to solve for. I have every belief that as the price certainly moves above 60 that we'll see service cost inflation. So I've assumed a little service cost inflation from above 60. I think between here and 60, there's a lot of capacity where we're not going to likely see a lot of service cost inflation. And I'm staying with onshore now as a commentary, not so much the deep water. I think the onshore business between here and $60 has a lot of room to be able to negotiate service contracts, particularly under multi-year contracts. But we're going to have service cost inflation. I mean, at some point, the Halliburtons, the Schlumbergers, and everybody else that have laid off a lot of people, as they bring people back on and they get back to something above cash break even for the service they're providing, they're going to demand it, and we're going to see it. And how much service cost inflation we get in there and how much it erodes that margin above 60 is probably still a to be determined. But I'll make the comment, between here and $60 a barrel, I don't fear there's a lot of service cost inflation that's likely to get baked in onshore.
Thanks. Hi, Al. Ken Evans with SAP. A lot of the customers that I talk to struggle with being able to make the justification for IT investments when they have to compete with all the development activities, right? And we know that it's one capital budget, right? So what would be your advice to this room that when they're bringing stuff forward to their management teams, how do they need to best position that?
You know, the way I would describe it is much like a company that doesn't invest in its PP&E, its plant, property, and equipment. At some point, the longer you delay that PP&E investment, then the investment costs a lot more. So it's easier to do it incrementally than it is all at once. And so there's going to need to be and should be room in a budget every year to incrementally improve what you're doing with your IT infrastructure or your systems. Anything that you see as something you need to invest in. For me, as I think about ours, I mean, it's certainly the last 2 years and in the last year, we've had to shrink, our budget below what I'd like to see it. But I think going to zero is a really big problem. And because if you do that, you can do that, but you're going to end up paying a whole lot more later, maybe at a time when you can least afford it.
How would you describe Anadarko's culture, and how do you leverage this to stand out from your peers?
Well, I think every company, particularly companies that are considered to be high-performing and industry leaders as companies, have a culture. And our culture, as an example, is probably a little different than EOG's. I consider EOG to be an exceptional company that's well-run and has a very strong culture. We decided back in 2004 to put in what we thought were the things that we wanted not only our employees but our contractors to live by, our core values. And for the last 12 years, we've worked really hard to instill a culture with certain guiding lights for that. I think the thing is, that, and I think the easiest way to describe it, I remember as a very young person in the oil and gas business being told by somebody who was probably even a little older than I am now at 59, something that never really got lost on me, and that is, in your career, you have control of one thing, and that's your reputation. And when you don't have a good reputation, it's really hard to overcome, and as you get older, it becomes impossible to overcome. So when your company has a good reputation as somebody to be in a well with, to have somebody that treats their contractors the way they want their own employees to be treated, somebody that puts a safety environment first and foremost, not only again for their employees, but for their contractors, and gives people a sense of why they come to work at that company every day. I think that kind of culture is something that makes you feel good, because I mean, most of the people in our industry that are really good, they go to work anywhere. They go to work where they feel most comfortable and most rewarded, not just financially, but rewarded for their ideas, their ability to bring things forward. And while financial wherewithal is not to be lost in that equation, I think very few high-performing people work just for the compensation. I think they work for a lot of other rewards in life, and you've got to have an environment where people feel like they can do that. As we think about, what can we always do to make our culture better, to make it more important, that we continue to do things, I keep coming back to what I've been talking about this morning. I think technology is going to lead where we go as an industry in the next decade. There will be companies that will get on board with that, and there are going to be others that get lost. And you can already see that have and have not division. So investing in systems that deliver things, investing in technologies that improve things, we all have to get on board with that. Now, I will say, and I remember vividly when I was the chief financial officer 11 years ago, we bought Kerr McGee and Western Gas Resources on the same day. And in the middle of all that, you'd never know something else was going on. We actually cut over from being a full cost to a successful efforts company. That was a trick. We also cut over our platform to SAP all at the same time and all in the same quarter. So if you think about a circus act, try buying two companies on the same day, your market cap again, changing your method of accounting and changing your platform and getting it all done in the same quarter. SAP, not to sound like I'm doing an advertisement for it, SAP, had we not had the ability to cut over to SAP with the flexibility it gave us, we would never have been able to cut over in one quarter from full cost to successful efforts, much less be able to assimilate the acquisitions.
Yeah, Mike Neal from Petrotechnics. You talked about technology helping improve margin. Do you have any comments on how the similar technologies could help improve safety and reduce risk?
Yeah, the same way in which I think today that we take data to understand how we drill a well faster, quicker, cheaper, there are safety things that fall out as well in terms of practices and things that we see ourselves doing, because all of us that work in our industry know that if we're not safe, everything else doesn't matter. If we're not capable of putting an environment in place where our employees feel like they're safe, it doesn't matter. So I do today we do use, and I think from our HSE perspective, we do look at data and try to understand from the data, being able to do things with data that we could never have imagined 5 years ago, how we improve the environment for folks that we work with directly and indirectly.
Al, you talked about the fact that you brought in talent from the big data side, AI side, into the boardroom. What about beyond the boardroom? Where are you there?
To use the baseball terminology, I think we're rounding second. I think we have figured out how to take it to the point where I feel pretty much like we've got a double. And the question is, how do we bring it home? And we're right in the middle of trying to figure that out. And those of you that know Mario Cole in our organization, he's been tasked with giving me a recommendation in 2 weeks to be able to bring that into a decision point, which I think we'll be prepared to do. But I do think, like the way in which, like recently we moved from onshore being organized in a functional matter into a business unit matter, because I think our business in general requires us to be organized with a business unit type of format, because I think it drives better results by play, by business type. And functional works if you're really, really large and you're trying to deploy resources over a larger base, but I'm not sure it really helps a lot for an independent oil and gas company to be set up functionally. Same thing's probably true when you think about technology. Most of us today don't have a chief technology officer. We have a chief information, CIO. He actually has a petroleum engineering degree, and he happens to be pretty good at data and pretty good at systems. So I have a unique animal in the kingdom. But as we think about where we're going to be in the next decade, I think there's certain things that we're just going to have to figure out and do a little bit differently. I'm not exactly sure I know what Mario's going to recommend to me or what we'll decide to do from that recommendation. But I do think, much like we looked at our onshore business and decided that having a functional organizational structure versus a business unit approach needed to change, I think it's the way in which we think about deploying technology, leveraging that technology, and then using that technology for a modest amount of R&D. We're probably not getting the bang for our buck today that we would like to get. So that's why I think we're at second base, but we're still a long ways from home.
I wanted to shift gears a lot and ask about, you talked about leading the talent. And maybe you could share with some of us some of your approach or philosophy on leading the talent. What do you think about? How do you approach that to get the most out of your team?
Well, one thing's pretty sure. Really bright, really hardworking men and women don't want to be micromanaged. Really average, really okay people, they don't mind being micromanaged. So if you're hiring the best and the brightest, she or he is not going to put up with being micromanaged. So one of the things when you really decide, you create an environment where you encourage people that it's okay to hire somebody that's smarter than you. A lot of people are kind of afraid of that. Like, oh, I'm afraid she's going to be able to do things I can't in 5 years, so I'm going to hire somebody that's not quite that smart. Well, that's sort of a loser strategy. But if you hire them and you micromanage them, you will lose them. So my word of advice is, if you want to go with the Frank Broyles comment of you can't coach speed, and you decide to hire speed, don't put a harness on them. Don't try to micromanage them. Let them go. And give them the opportunity to make some mistakes. That's the other thing. I mean, in an industry that is very different than Silicon Valley, where a 29-year-old can be at the top of the heap, and the next individual to make a difference in a certain subset of the technology space, there's not really the opportunity for a 29-year-old woman or man to do that in our industry easily, because there's a lot of lessons learned, there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be imparted, there's a lot of things that you just have to figure out, and the more you can understand how to make those mistakes without it being detrimental, that's probably one of the best things. Because when you look around and you think about some of the environments that we drill wells in, they're pretty difficult, they're pretty harsh. And you think about the places in the world in which we do that, a lot of third world, undeveloped nations. The president of Mozambique will actually be in the Woodlands this week. Those of you may know we, along with some others, have found quite a bit of gas offshore Mozambique. And he's coming in as we're trying to figure out some of the things that we need the government to do contractually and legally in order to get to a process of being able to do some things that would lead ultimately, we hope, to taking an FID decision on some LNG, which will dramatically change the country. I mean, the country will go from being the 9th poorest country in the world per capita to somewhere probably in the middle within 10 years. So he really feels a lot of gravity to making this thing happen. And so I'm looking forward to having him in our offices on Friday. I see him when I'm in country, but this is the first time he'll be in our offices. But it's been interesting as we have seconded into our organization a lot of Mozambicans that are educated, that are trying to understand and learn our business more. You know, again, you can see that need not to micromanage talent. And if you micromanage really talented people, they'll go work somewhere else.
Good morning, George Elert, SAP. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to listen to you speak with such conviction about the potential of technology. And working with our clients, we hear to a large extent that the rate of technology-enabled change needs support by business executives. And I bet you many in this room wish they had a C-level executive that speak as passionately about technology as you do. How can they influence the thinking of their executives to come to the same place that you are?
You know, I think you might be surprised. I know whether I'm at the Business Roundtable or more aptly even the Business Council, if you don't know the difference between the Business Roundtable is largely a politically based lobbying organization of the largest company CEOs in our country. Whereas the Business Council is a Chatham House rules format where about 100 CEOs a year get together. And in that environment, we really talk to one another about what we're doing, what we're not doing, what problems we have. And it's quite, this last year, Jeff Bezos has been the Business Council chair. And you would be surprised around that room of what I'd say are the largest, not just in the US, I mean, Ben Bearden with Shell's a member of the Business Council. I can keep going. There's a lot of companies outside the U.S. that are in. I just was able to support and nominate and get in Patrick Pouyanné, the CEO of Total. In that environment, the point is, you'd be surprised how everybody realizes that they need more, not less, technology. And technology is really important. I think what's hard is when I sit with Gina Rometty, who runs IBM. She is running a huge company that moves, I wouldn't say at glacial pace, but moves slower, like an aircraft carrier, compared to the PT boats that you would see in Silicon Valley. Her concerns, her issues, frankly, would be harder for me to figure out how to take into practice and application to be better than it is for us being able to use all the resources we have available. But I almost, to a person, I'm amazed at the connectivity to the issue of how do we use technology to do things. We actually had one session in Menlo Park about a year ago where every session dealt with how do we use technology differently. And how do we think about technologies differently in our own business as a game changer? Because, you know, as they like to use the word disruptions in the tech space, particularly in Silicon Valley, they were all, I mean, a lot of it was dealing with how are we going to manage the next disruption in our industry from a data standpoint. So I think there's a tremendous amount of insight beyond what might be apparent in the management of frankly, the largest companies in this country. I don't see a void or an absence or a disagreement that technology is not needed to change things. I think it's definitely seen as an important part, and if not a change agent in some industries. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure to be here this morning. It was a long commute. It was a couple of blocks for me. I don't normally have this short of commute, but it's wonderful to be here. It's a great conference. Thank you for having me.